All right, I think we've got a good critical mass here. So, first of all, welcome everyone and good morning. Really happy that you're all here. My name is Jessica Gable, and I'm a senior program manager with Sunstone Strategies. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be your host today. Um, we're really excited today to offer you this expert panel webinar to launch um, a really cool report called A Better Deal for Californians, The Rise of Battery Storage Over Gas. And as its title implies, the report details the substantial cost savings from battery storage, including lower utility bills for ratepayers, reduced cost to the state's energy system, and the prevention of health-related expenses linked to gas pollution. So this is a joint report between CEERT, the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies, a nonprofit organization based in Sacramento that works towards advancing the state's renewable energy portfolio and emission reduction goals through effective policy and grassroots advocacy. And the second partner is the Regenerate Coalition. Regenerate California is a coalition led by the California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA, and the Sierra Club in partnership with the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, called CAUSE, Communities for a Better Environment, CVE, and the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, CCAEJ. Regenerate California's mission is to transition California away from gas-fired power plants and toward a just, clean energy economy that is powered by 100% renewable energy resources. So we have some incredible panelists for you today, all of whom contributed to this report. Just a few housekeeping items. You will all receive a copy of the report as well as a copy of this recorded webinar after the webinar is done. Please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions that you might have. We'll be monitoring that Q&A box throughout the webinar, and then at the very end, we'll save some time for questions. And with that, I am really happy to pass the mic to our first speaker, Maya Leroy. Maya is the policy director at CEERT and is primarily focused on grid reliability, energy affordability, and the timely build-out of renewable infrastructure through the integration of state policy with technical analysis. Welcome, Maya.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks for that great introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. We're really excited to speak with you all today on our new report. Let's go ahead and go to the first slide, please. So a large part of the cost of generators comes from the operation and maintenance. In other words, what's needed to actually build, run, and maintain the generator. So under O&M, we have to consider both fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs being those that can be expected to remain the same. So this would look like workforce, routine maintenance, site leases, and so on. And then variable costs are those that can change over time due to outside factors. An example of this might be that natural gas prices, which are very volatile, are generally trending upwards. And this creates an uncertainty in the cost trajectory of gas generation. Events that trigger supply and demand, especially at the global level, add to this volatility. One example of this that we've seen in recent days is that President Trump has proposed increasing liquefied natural gas exports, lowering domestic supply, and so many experts argue that this could trigger increased prices. On the other hand, batteries, the cost of electricity needed to charge the battery replaces that need for fuel. And though this is still a variable cost, it's relatively lower due to what's called energy arbitrage. Or in other words, we can actually charge the battery when there's abundant, cheap renewable generation available, as opposed to paying for more expensive electricity prices, or in some cases, even charge it for relatively free when co-located with the renewables that are over-generating during midday. And I say free only in air quotes because this just means that the energy is not actually able to be sold on the energy market during those times because there's already so much being sold already. Another factor to be considered is the investments into plants. And so something you'll hear is, well, we've already paid to construct the gas plants. And so, yes, it's true that the initial investment has already been made, but you have to consider, is continuing operations actually worth it economically? And so on top of increasing fuel prices, the extension of operations also requires modernization of plants. This ensures that they can still run as they get older. And this creates a very costly short-term investment. So kind of outweighs the purpose, right? It becomes more like a sunk cost fallacy at that point. Batteries, on the other hand, although they require a significant initial investment upfront, they can offer long-term savings through cheaper O&M. Let's go to the next slide. And so a major portion of generators' costs also comes from what's called resource adequacy. And so what is resource adequacy? RA is California's regulatory framework that ensures that there's always enough capacity available on the grid to meet demand. Load-serving entities are required to uphold RA by showing that they have reliable access to enough generation to meet this demand. And so how this affects costs is that because an LSC, in order to secure this net qualifying capacity, the load-serving entities have to enter into RA contracts with the generator. So this means that the utilities pay the generators to guarantee that they will have the specified amount of qualifying capacity available for dispatch. And in turn, the LSCs can then count that towards their RA requirement. It's important to note that RA contracts are not the same as energy contracts. And this means that a utility is often paying for eligible resources 2 times. Once to ensure that it will be available when they need it, and a second time to actually generate and dispatch that energy to end users. And so this is the reason why gas plants are often able to be very competitive with their RA costs, despite being costly to operate, because they can make up for charging lower RA costs with higher market prices when they actually generate and dispatch that energy. And so now you might be asking, well, why are they able to offer lower RA prices to stay competitive? And to answer that question, we now have to understand how resources qualify for RA capacity. Next slide, please. So in very, very simple terms, to qualify for RA, a resource has to be available when it's needed. And so renewables, for example, can fluctuate, right? Solar drops off at the end of the day, wind can be unpredictable. So historically, gas plants have been the primary resource contracted for under RA since they could be fired up at any time of day. But with batteries now also being able at any time of day, they're becoming extremely competitive for RA eligibility, and especially under the new slice of day framework. And so this table here offers some of the comparisons between the old framework and the new slice of day. It's pulled directly from our report, so if you can't read it all right now, you could definitely go back and look at it later. But some important things to note under what's changed with slice of day. So under slice of day, grid conditions are now assessed on an hour-by-hour basis. And this comes in comparison to what used to be a 1 peak demand hour under the old framework. And so now we're seeing a little bit more favor given to resources that can dispatch quickly, since obviously those grid conditions, you're looking at hour by hour, can change very quickly. So gas plants, which can take significant time to ramp up, can't compare nearly as well to the impeccable speed of batteries, which can dispatch in a fraction of a second. Another major change here is that batteries are no longer constrained to the 4-hour duration as they have been before, because now their incentives under RA can actually scale to duration. So an example of this might be that a load-serving entity notices a shortfall for durations shorter than 4 hours, in which case a short duration battery, maybe 1-hour batteries, would make for a more attractive option. Next slide, please. And so this slide is kind of a bonus slide here. The Strategic Reliability Reserve, which was established in 2022 by AB 205, which is composed of 3 parts, DEBA, DSGS, which are both administered by the CEC. But we're going to be looking at this third part, the Electricity Supply Strategic Reliability Reserve Program, big mouthful, which is administered by the Department for Water Resources. And so this, I say this is a bonus slide because this comes separate of ratepayers. This program is actually paid for by taxpayers, but still definitely contributes to the overall affordability of energy in general. So the reserve's intent is to ensure that we have grid reliability during extreme events, and it does so by creating an emergency backup generation reserve to be called upon during grid emergencies. And by grid emergencies, usually in California, we're we're talking about really hot summer days where everybody is running their air conditioner and there's not enough electricity on the grid to be able to meet that demand. And so on those days, these generators, in theory, would be fired up and, well, actually, they're fired up ahead of time. They're on standby and ready to go. And then we would use this electricity to meet that demand. The issue is that we haven't actually really been needing them very much. And so if you look in this chart here, there are these are all the resources that are in the reserve. But these three very large portions come from extremely polluting once through cooling power plants. I'm talking about Alamitos, Huntington Beach, and Ormond Beach generating stations. So you can see they're split up across a little bit more than three, but that's just because they have different units. And so the majority of generation in the reserves comes from these, and these generators are paid for in billions of dollars of taxpayer funds. So far, we've spent over $1 billion of dollars that have actually been dispersed, and there's plans to spend over $1 billion more. And so remember, I said that we fire these up ahead of time. And so the catch is these generators are actually paid to be on standby, whether we use them or not. So we're spending billions of dollars on generation that we hardly even use, truthfully. And so a question that remains here on the reserve is whether the use of costly OTC plants is still warranted, given the substantial improvement in reliability that has been enabled by the influx of battery storage. Next slide, please. And so this slide just shows you exactly how much battery storage has really grown in the last few years. I mean, this is a tremendous increase. So I just wanted to include that for you all to admire. Next slide, please. Okay, so what still needs to change? So under RA, there are three types of capacity that load-serving entities have to procure for. System capacity, which is how much capacity is needed across the entire territory. Flexible capacity, which is the capacity needed that can quickly adjust their output. And local capacity, which is capacity needed to serve a very specific geographical region. And this is especially important for when we have transmission constraints that might limit the amount of capacity that can actually enter the area from outside. And so most resources check that first box pretty easily. Batteries are especially good at checking that second box, but the third one is where we're seeing a major challenge. So local reliability constraints, because they're located within these pockets, what ends up happening is that we have a need for local gas generation because the gas generators are already located in there, and it's very difficult to actually get the renewable, cleaner energy to flow into these regions with those transmission constraints. So a way that we can do, or the way that we could replace this need for local gas generation and replace it with battery storage is we have to address those constraints by reducing interconnection bottlenecks. So this means making it easier for batteries to interconnect at points of interconnection within those regions, and also expanding the transmission grid, which has just tended to be a solution in general across this entire sector. And so, of course, policymakers to do these things will need to continue making progress on addressing the lengthy permitting delays to allow for these upgrades to happen. I'm sure everyone has heard probably 100 times now that it takes on average 10 or more years to construct a line. And so that stands to be our biggest challenge still with meeting that local reliability. So if California can overcome these hurdles, then we can unlock more energy savings by greatly reducing our consumption of gas generation and switching over to increased battery storage. And that concludes my presentation. I will go ahead and pass over to Tyler at CEHA.
Thanks, Maya. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tyler Valdez, and I'm the Interim Energy Justice Director at CEHA. And CEHA is one of the organizations that leads the Regenerate California Coalition that co-authored this report. We're a statewide community-led alliance of 10 grassroots base building organizations that work together to achieve environmental justice by advancing policy solutions at the statewide level. And it's my honor to now introduce our next speaker and my colleague, Hina Singh, who is an energy justice manager at CEERT, where she leads the Regenerate California Coalition in retiring gas-fired power plants across California, starting with those in EJ communities. And in her role, Hina combines policy, data modeling, community organizing, and storytelling to implement regulation that centers frontline communities and drives forward a democratic and decarbonized grid. And Hina will be talking about NEIs, which stands for non-energy impacts. And those are essentially a project's social and environmental impacts that are not directly associated with the cost or benefits of the energy that they provide. So, for example, you can think of air quality, water quality, land use impacts, economic impacts to local communities, as well as resilience. So I'll pass it over to you, Hina. Take it away.
Tyler. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you for joining us today. Next slide, please. So before we get into non-energy impacts, I wanted to just spend a moment providing a little bit more context around gas plants in California. So California has over 200 gas plants across the state, and more than half are sited in disadvantaged communities. These are working class communities of color and the result of decades of systemic racism and inequitable energy and land use planning. So this is not by accident, but this is kind of what we're looking at. It's like the communities that are sited nearest these gas plants are bearing the brunt of a lot of emissions and health impacts that are coming from these gas plants, which is why at Regenerate California, we are committed to shutting down all gas plants across California, starting with those in environmental justice communities first. And the thing about gas plants too that we've learned about over the last several years is just that gas plants are not reliable and they are expensive to maintain and keep around. On the screen, we have a screenshot of a previous report that we have put out, California's underperforming gas plants. And in this report, we examined the heat wave of 2022 and actually looked at how gas plants performed during that heat wave, where it was found that, in fact, many of the gas plants were curtailed and were unable to provide the reliability that was promised. And additionally, they were also negatively impacting communities with skyrocketing emissions during their startups. And so we hear this all the time from agencies that gas plants are like around because of reliability. And as Maya just covered in the Strategic Reliability Reserve, we still see one through cooling or OTC gas plants included there. And basically, what we're trying to share in this presentation and in our report, which I hope you'll read, is that the time for gas plants has come to an end, and there are new technologies like battery energy storage that can fill this gap and be a reliable energy resource. And so the other piece of this is during grid emergencies like the 2022 heat wave is like, we see how gas plants can serve system reliability, but not always local reliability. So during an emergency, we see that communities nearest these gas plants are breathing in toxins that may not even have reliable electricity. So this is a form of environmental racism. California's energy grid and reliability shouldn't come at the sacrifice or expense of communities' health, safety, and quality of life. We shouldn't have to make that trade-off, and we don't have to anymore with batteries. And so when we talk about energy justice and we talk about a just transition, we're talking about communities who are most burdened from the current extractive and polluting energy systems should be the first ones that benefit from and co-govern the new regenerative and clean energy system. And so with that, next slide, please. We can get into non-energy impacts. So as you can see on the screen, this is like a little bit of a graphic of what Tyler shared as well. Non-energy impacts, or NEIs, are a project's impacts to communities and the environment that aren't associated with the economic costs and benefits. So a lot of what Maya was focused on in her presentation were like the economic aspects of both technologies. And now we really want to focus on, but what about the social costs and the social impacts? And so you can see on the screen some of the social costs are the emissions, right? So we have NOx emissions that are precursors to smog. They can cause serious lung and cardiovascular impacts and increased mortality. We have PM 2.5, particulate matter, which is closely correlated with decreased lung function, more frequent emergency department visits, and hospitalizations. And then, of course, carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions and their impact on our climate and environment. These are examples of NEIs that will cost billions of dollars. And we see hospitalizations, asthma attacks, chronic illnesses. These are examples of NEIs, as well as the medical bills that people have to pay associated with these issues. And in fact, we found in a report from 2020 that US residents pay $820 billion in health expenses due to burning fossil fuels and climate change. So this is a big issue, clearly. In addition to seeing that economically on the cost side, it really doesn't make sense to keep gas plants around anymore. Now looking at the health impacts, the social impacts, you can see that even more so, this is not acceptable. And historically, we've seen some of the California regulatory agencies, NEIs are not a big part of the cost modeling exercises that take place. So currently, the way like the CAISO decides which transmission projects are green-lighted for the year, or the way that the PUC looks into their energy modeling, it's really based on like an economic model that looks at costs and benefits, but it's incomprehensive because it doesn't acknowledge some of these other real social factors like health impacts, but also like resilience and like ability to stay online during grid emergencies. And so there is now starting to be more dialogue on NEIs within these agencies. And the biggest question is looking at how do we measure NEIs? What are the metrics we need to look at to start incorporating into these agencies' processes? So with that, we'll go to our last slide, which is where do batteries fit in here? So a just transition does include batteries. Batteries, when paired with solar, can be are zero emission. You can avoid all of the NEIs we talked about entirely when batteries are paired with solar, because you don't have the health impacts associated with gas plants. We also see that energy resilience and community empowerment during grid emergencies in particular is really key here. We see that behind the meter batteries with microgrid capabilities allow communities to have a backup source to turn off or on when there's a power outage. And we see that many low-income residents and environmental justice communities have a more difficult time recovering from different environmental hardships. And so batteries can be a really critical solution here to increase resilience and preparedness. And then communities, we see that a lot of communities sited near gas plants have grid constraints like outdated transmission and distribution lines that lack the ability to accommodate other energy resources. And we see that a lot of this aging equipment is a result of decades of underinvestment. And so it's kind of like a cycle. These grid constraints prevent local clean energy resources from coming online to replace energy currently supplied by gas plants. And so it's perpetuating this cycle of extraction and harm. And we see batteries as a way to disrupt this cycle. So we see like front of the meter resources like solar and storage can be built closer to load centers, which eliminates the need for costly transmission upgrades. Like Maya had mentioned, could be anywhere like 10 years for a transmission project to get upgraded or built. And so this is huge in expediting community power, expediting the ability for folks to have that emergency preparedness. It will shorten interconnection queues, and then ultimately it will reduce the cost for ratepayers through their bills, which is huge. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Tyler and we'll get into some case studies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hina. Next up, we have Rosalind Tovar, who is an energy researcher at CBE and has experience in energy research, housing outreach coordination, and community education. Her work supports frontline communities, advocating for a transition away from fossil fuel infrastructure toward clean energy and community governed systems. And their background is in biology, and she's part of the Regenerate California Coalition. So here's Rosalind to share some case studies.
Thank you, Tyler, for the introduction, and thanks, Hina, for grounding us in how gas plants also have impacts to communities beyond just cost. So I want to start by uplifting two community stories that are in the report. One is in Wilmington, where residents suffer health impacts living directly next to a gas plant, a harbor generating station. And another is, and the next case study is an environmental justice community as well in Oxnard that stopped a gas plant from being built and got energy storage instead. So starting with the Wilmington case study, Wilmington is located in the harbor area in Los Angeles. It's majority Latinx, working class. It's one of the most polluted neighborhoods in California. And Wilmington is not a stranger to pollution. There's the Port of LA. We have oil refining, drilling, and there's also major freeways. And there's also one of LADWP's gas plants, harbor generating station. And one thing to note before we hop into the community interview that we had is that this plant is currently still operating. But long-term, DWP wants to retrofit it to combust hydrogen instead of gas. And Wilmington, as well as Regenerate, has been continuing the fight to replace gas plants like harbor generating station with non-combustive alternatives like battery energy storage. Okay, next slide. All right, so here we have our community member, Maria Serafin. She is a long-term resident of Wilmington. She's been there over 25 years, and she's also a core member at Communities for a Better Environment. She got into advocacy and community organizing through her son. Her son developed asthma at a really young age, and seeing how her son was impacted by pollution motivated her to speak up and to advocate for other families that are facing similar circumstances in environmental justice communities. And then one thing to note in her interview, she also talks about like rising rates and bills and how she is paying for these bills, and energy is going not just to Wilmington, but to other places. And she's not really seeing these benefits, and she's paying with her health, essentially, not just with the cost. So very powerful interview with Maria Serafin. And we could go on to, oh wait, we could go back. Oh, yeah. And before I move on to Oxnard, I do want to highlight that this is the non-energy impacts that Hina was talking about. And these harms really get ignored in energy planning. And Wilmington is a frontline community, and it's been powering Los Angeles for decades. And community members should not have to pay with their livelihoods, and we should really stop treating this resiliency that community members have and like a privilege that's just reserved for higher income zip codes. So just want to uplift that. And Maria's story isn't, the impacts of gas are not abstract. They are lived every day by these families. And the just transition is ending that harm and making sure communities like Wilmington lead the way. And next slide, please. Okay. And this is the Puente gas plant case study. This is a victory in Oxnard. Here we have community members in Oxnard in 2014. NRG proposed that the Puente gas plant be built in Oxnard, which is like Wilmington, is also working class, a Latinx community, and it's also burdened by pollution due to agriculture, multiple gas plants, Superfund sites, and the Central Coast Alliance, United for a Sustainable Economy cause, and community members fought back against this project. And communities shouldn't really be the dumping ground for another industrial pollution project. So this is one of the big, sorry, my screen changed. But yeah, despite CPUC approval for this project, there was a huge public opposition that triggered a CAISO study. And after the study, they looked at the clean alternatives, including battery energy storage. And then flash forward to 3 years later, in 2017, the project is rejected and replaced with a Ventura energy storage facility of 100 megawatts. And this would not have been possible without the advocacy and community members that fought back in Ventura County. And just to put it in perspective, this specific project, energy storage project, was enough to power all of Oxnard, which is 50,000 households, or I think the population is about 200,000. And so, yeah, the Puente win is really about community power and how pairing that with technical expertise can change the course of energy planning. And it wasn't just a victory over one gas plant, it really set the precedent for replacing gas with clean, reliable battery storage and has really shaped the goals of Regenerate Coalition. And one thing to note before ending the Oxnard victory is that the fight is still continuing. Despite this win, the Ormond Beach Generating Station is still in Ventura, and the cause and Regenerate has been fighting to have it shut down for years. And it continues to get extended despite all of our advocacy work. And yeah, I think it's important that we continue this fight and our advocacy at the State Lands Commission to make sure that the lease isn't extended for Ormond Beach Generating Station, and as well as removing it from the SRR. So just want to uplift that. And battery storage isn't just a clean energy fix, it's really a path towards climate justice. And we want to continue this work while centering the communities that live there, so that they're part of the process and can say how they want and where these batteries are being deployed. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to the next speaker, and we can talk more about the policy recommendations.
Thank you, Rosalind, so much for sharing those really humanizing stories of exactly what we're talking about, this transition from gas-fired power plants to this emerging technologies and battery storage, and what that really means for everyday people that are involved in this fight. So it's now time to transition over to our policy recommendations, which will be shared by Julia, who's a senior campaign organizer at Sierra Club, working throughout California on retiring gas plants and building out clean energy. And Sierra Club is a founding member of and helps lead the Regenerate California Coalition. And Sierra Club works closely with CEJA to coordinate, to plan, and lead the work for Regenerate to advocate for gas plant retirements in EJ communities. So with that, I'll pass it over to Julia.
Thank you, Tyler. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here with you today, and I'm very excited for the release of this report, really highlighting why we need a just transition off of gas plants and how batteries can help us get there in an affordable way. I'm going to talk now about our policy and regulatory recommendations from this report. Thanks so much. Okay, so our first recommendation, first and foremost, given the findings of our report, we are recommending that the California Public Utilities Commission update and refine the Resource Adequacy program to really adequately reflect the reliability and other benefits, like we talked about today, associated with renewable energy paired with battery storage on the grid, and to prioritize getting this cost-effective clean energy to locations where it's needed most. These include areas that have high electric load and are currently relying on gas plants to meet their load. In the RA proceeding, which is resource adequacy, Regenerate has actually proposed that centralized procurement of resources include financial incentives to build local clean energy, which would include battery storage within the local capacity areas where we currently rely on gas plants. With an incentive like this, a financial incentive, we're more likely to cite clean energy resources where it's needed most to displace gas. And you'll hear a big theme of, locationality being really key in a lot of these recommendations. Our second recommendation, we are strongly recommending that the Governor's Office, the Public Utilities Commission, and CAISO, which is California's independent system operator that does transmission planning, we want to see these three entities work together to reduce the state's reliance on gas plants, in particular in local areas that are capacity constrained due to existing transmission constraints on the current grid. And this is really important not only to protect communities, like we heard from Hina and Roslyn earlier, and also to protect our environment from harmful emissions from gas plants, but also to reach the state's stated goal of 100% clean energy by 2045, which it was made through the SB 100 bill, which passed in 2018, and as well as complying with another law, SB 887, which requires both the PUC and CAISO to substantially reduce reliance on gas plants in their planning. Our third recommendation is also for the PUC and CAISO. These two agencies really have a prime opportunity right now in the upcoming integrated resource planning proceeding and the transmission planning process to ensure that battery energy storage systems, or BESS, can help deliver the much needed clean energy to local areas currently relying on gas plants. Doing so will require CAISO and the PUC to work closely together to ensure that there's appropriate transmission capacity to deliver this clean energy where it's needed most. And so we are really recommending that these two agencies are working closely together to ensure this goal. And our fourth recommendation, one of the most immediate actions that the Governor's Office, the CEC, and the PUC can take right now is updating the Strategic Reliability Reserve. And this was mentioned by Maya earlier. The reserve was developed in 2022 by AB 205 to ensure that there's enough resources on the grid to meet demand during grid emergencies. As we've discussed, the grid has changed substantially since 2022, due in large part to the amount of battery storage that has been added to the grid. These agencies can take action right now to reduce reliance on gas plants and redistribute funding to clean energy programs through the Strategic Reliability Reserve. Currently, $1.2 billion in the Strategic Reliability Reserve is allocated to keeping the state's once-through cooling plants online, mainly on standby since we haven't needed their capacity in the past 2 years. And as batteries and renewable energy are making the grid more and more reliable, this money should really be redirected to support programs like the Demand Side Grid Support Program, or DSGS, and the Distributed Electricity Backup Assets Program. And if you could go to the next slide. We have 2 more recommendations here. These are a bit more targeted recommendations. So our 5th recommendation is directed at the State Water Board and the CEC. So now more than ever, the State Water Board and the CEC must retire these once-through cooling plants and not extend their long overdue retirements. These plants have already had their life extended twice, and they're long past their useful life. OTC plants also negatively impact communities they're sited in, including the communities of Oxnard, Long Beach, and Huntington Beach. And they also have really extreme negative impacts on waterways and marine life. So we really want to make sure these plants are retired as soon as possible. And finally, our last recommendation. So the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, or LADWP, as Rosalind mentioned earlier, they have shared plans to burn hydrogen in their 4 in-basin gas plants in LA. And given the success that we've been seeing with battery storage, we really want to urge LADWP to explore local energy solutions like BESS systems instead of their current plans to retrofit their gas plants to burn hydrogen. So these are our 6 recommendations from this report. And with that, I will pass it back to Jessica for our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you to all of our panelists for really excellent presentations here. So I see we've got a few questions in the chat box. So I am going to kick us off, I think, with addressing Moss Landing. So there are a few questions in here about how we tackle battery plant fires, like the fires in January and February at Moss Landing, and how do we approach this from an environmental justice and community perspective. So obviously we have a few different panelists who can address this. I will first pass it to Hina to get us started.
Appreciate these questions. I think it's really important that we talk about this. Ensuring that battery energy storage is safe for our communities is really important. And what happened at Moss Landing was really tragic. Something that we like to keep in mind, though, is that the battery storage technology and the safety standards are constantly improving. So California legislators have already established regulations to protect communities from these impacts, which includes the California's General Order 167 requirements that are much farther along than they were years ago. And generally, when we talk about batteries and think about like upcoming battery projects, Regenerate California generally supports batteries in communities as long as certain safety requirements are met. And this includes undergoing thorough environmental review, being designed and operated with strong protections against fires, toxic releases, and system failures, and then accountability throughout the entire life cycle of a battery project. And just acknowledging that, you know, today we have a lot better knowledge and information on battery chemistry and how they need to be constructed for safety. What happened at Moss Landing was also just a use of outdated technology and battery chemistry that isn't made typically anymore in that way. And I think what's so important to remember is, I know we hear so much about Moss Landing in the news and we see it everywhere, but there are more fires and explosions from oil and gas compared to batteries. It's quite negligible, actually, but we don't hear those in the news as often. So that's just an important perspective to bring to this. Of course, we want battery projects to be as safe as possible. I think a big part of this is also just educating folks about like, what do we know about batteries now, and what technologies are we using to make sure it's the safest it can be. So maybe I'll pass it to Maya if you want to add anything else about the technology front.
Yeah, I think, very important on the conversation of battery safety that has not really been taken into account is that there are so many different types of battery energy storage systems, right? Lithium ion is not the only one. It's just been the, kind of standard practice in the battery industry. And so going forward, something else that's also going to have to change with deploying more batteries is going to be looking at the various applications and safety mechanisms behind each tech, and actually looking application to application if this is the best type of technology to use, right? So if you're going to be locating a battery in a fire-prone area, you're probably not going to want to use one that has, higher risk of thermal runaway, or safety concerns around that. In lithium ion has been the standard just because under the old RA framework, it met that 4-hour duration. But going forward, it doesn't have to be. We can really diversify. And so part of how we address that, not only on the safety mechanisms and the permitting aspects that have to go into vetting safety, is also trying to create more incentives to diversify the technology that we use.
Thank you, Hina and Maya. And thank you, everybody, for inputting these great questions. I am going to move us along to another question about battery energy storage, this one from Fernando Morales. Do you have recommendations on how to thoughtfully engage in early stages of a battery energy storage project to elevate community voices, educate, and get engagement in fighting misinformation currently existing about battery energy storage systems? That is a really good question. So, Julia, can I toss this one to you?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Fernando, for the question. Well, I think first and foremost, you're asking the right questions as a company coming into the space, really wanting to meet community where they're at. I think that we are seeing, as we've discussed, some negative press around battery storage. And a big thing that we want to make sure is also uplifted are the huge benefits that come with battery storage infrastructure and how it can reduce impacts, especially air pollution impacts to communities. So I think uplifting those benefits is very important in combating this misinformation. I also think really just starting with listening to the community, meeting the community where they're at, maybe hosting listening sessions and hearing their concerns. That would be a big recommendation of mine when especially if you're new to a community and this is the first battery storage project, for example, in a community. I would also say that there's often a lot of distrust with, just we historically have had such extractive energy systems. And in this just transition, we are trying to right a lot of wrongs. So I think a lot of what we want to see is how can the community really benefit from this new type of energy? And I would just be curious can you have conversations with communities about the benefits they would like to see from battery storage projects? Yeah, and so those are my thoughts, and I'll also pass it to Hina to see if she wants to add anything.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, I think this is a great question and just important to think about, what is the best way for developers to coordinate with communities? And I think one of the key things is also like when you're proposing a project is like making sure the community is very informed on the evacuation protocols and information about the site as well. So everybody feels safe about the way it's being designed and they would feel comfortable knowing what to do in case of an emergency. I think, and in terms of like listening sessions, like Julia mentioned, like I think what's important is just being able to engage with communities like before a lot of like major decisions have already been made, like bring community into the process. I think a big thing is like there's the importance of consent from a community as well. Like I feel like this step kind of gets missed sometimes in projects. It's like before deciding and citing a project is, can you go into the community and like work with them and see if there's interest in something like this? And then also listening sessions, education around batteries is important as well. I think there should be like enough notices for community members to engage, opportunities to comment, ability to really engage in a meaningful collaborative way, and looking into funding opportunities so that folks have capacity to come out and listen and learn. As a resource and tool, I would recommend Rosa Gonzalez's spectrum of community engagement to ownership, and looking at how we can really strive towards a more collaborative and community-owned decision-making process as you're going about that. But I think key is also, just as we're talking about battery safety, is like making sure everyone's on the same page about that, and how and all the benefits that can be brought to the community as a result, including like what Julia was saying, like the energy resilience, but also the cost. Like a lot of what Maya covered in the original part of the presentation is just like this economically, this makes a lot more sense and can help with lowering bills as well.
All right, let's see what other questions we have. So another question, does the report address non-energy impacts from batteries? This one I will toss to Maya first.
Sure. So we don't talk a lot about the non-energy impacts of batteries necessarily. I will say I think a lot of this discussion is still unfolding as we're seeing the kind of modern day application of batteries. It's still very nascent. But of course, what happened at Moss Landing is, it was a terrible thing. It's not something to write off. I will say that this situation was one that should not have happened, especially under the current regulatory rules that we have for battery storage systems. They're held up to much more, I'll say much higher standards safety-wise. And for some reason, this facility was not grandfathered into those requirements. And this facility also had a track record of, I'll say, safety concerns. This one just being, it's sad that this had to be the event that happened that really brought our attention to it. And so something that we need to see going forward is, how do we prevent that from happening? How do we prevent these battery facilities that have kind of slid under the radar and not following those standard battery safety requirements that new ones have to? And assuming we can do that and address them, then hopefully, those non-energy impacts are greatly reduced. So all that to say, I think this is still a developing conversation and might be a little bit too soon to really say how much it's impacting, but hopefully as time unfolds and these new regulations come out, we won't see things like this happen anymore.
Thanks, Maya. And let's see, would anyone else from Regenerate California like to take a stab at this question, maybe talk about the other benefits of batteries versus gas plants? All right, we can also move on. Okay, so we have another question about Moss Landing, and I think that totally makes sense. This is a very big moment in California's battery storage industry. So given the detrimental impacts after the fire, what can be done to get back on track with positioning battery energy storage facilities? I think that we've already answered this to a certain degree, but if anybody wants to talk about, again, efforts about what can be done to do battery storage better and do better engagement with communities, and some of the policy fixes that we're recommending in the report. Julia, is it okay if I toss this one to you?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's kind of two big picture things that are happening and need to continue to happen. And the first is around just combating the misinformation, as was mentioned before. The idea that battery storage just isn't safe at large, really trying to emphasize the safety parameters and guardrails that we want to see with battery storage systems, and that they have proven to be very safe. And what happened at Moss Landing was devastating. And it was a small percentage of the battery storage facilities. I think the other thing that's happening is the PUC recently updated their rules around battery safety. And so that's actually a big kind of positive in terms of creating battery storage systems that are going to, have a lot more oversight. And I think the other thing that needs to happen is really things that we're doing now, which is just talking about why we need battery storage in this transition to 100% clean energy, and all of the benefits that can go with it if we do it right and we engage communities and we ensure that there are really those safety guardrails the entire time. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Julia. Really appreciate that response. All right, so looking at our Q&A, I am going to see if there are some other questions, because we spent quite a lot of time on Moss Landing, and I do want to make sure that we get to other questions at this point. All right, so we have a question here about, are you advocating for community workforce agreements? I would again love for some folks from Regenerate California to talk about this, because community benefit agreements are so important in any kind of clean energy build out. Can I pass this one to you, Hina?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, yeah, it's a great question. I think, as I was saying earlier around like how should developers be working with communities and thinking about how we should be engaging. Yeah, community benefit agreements, community workforce agreements are a big part of this, so that the community feels included and also are directly benefiting from the work of like developing out the project and managing the project and maintaining it. So certainly, and I think that's a big, that also ties into a great opportunity for education around battery systems and building capacity, so that folks can also transition into the clean energy economy. I'll leave it at that unless someone else wants to add anything.
I can chime in just like on the context of like Regenerate and Seha working. Thank you, Tina. Yeah, I just want to add some like, yeah, context around Regenerate focuses on the statewide policy levers to advance the retirement of gas plants, but we're not necessarily advocating at a project by project level. So within SEHA, we do have our 10 member and partner organizations that are based locally across the state. And several of them are engaging in that kind of advocacy, especially, yeah, I think a big benefit that they see is the workforce development and economic opportunities. So it really comes down to local community-based organizations doing that advocacy, whereas, yeah, just like I said, Regenerate and SEHA, we're applying pressure, kind of like downward pressure from the state level. So yeah, to directly answer that question, it's like we're not directly advocating for workforce agreements and directly engaging on specific projects at this moment, but a lot of our members are. And so happy to connect you if there are specific projects you want to learn more about. But yeah, I'll leave it there and pass it back to Jessica.
Thanks, Tyler. Really appreciate that. All right, looking at our Q&A, we've got 7 open questions. So we've got about 15 minutes left We'll do our best to get through as many of these as we can. And again, if we do not get to your question, please bear with us. We will reach out to you after the webinar to make sure that we can hopefully tackle everybody's. All right, so let's tackle this question from David. Does the current negotiation concerning the budget for the coming year impact the goal of redirecting funds? So I know that Regenerate California has been involved in budget negotiations. So is it okay if I pass this to either Julia or Katie maybe to talk about the budget?
Yeah, we can take a stab at it. Although we have to make the disclosure that that at least Julie and I don't directly work on legislation. But we do know that there are budget conversations happening in Sacramento about whether to remove some of the funding for the programs within the Strategic Reliability Reserve. So within that program, there's the big bucket of funding for large gas plants, as well as other programs that focus on distributed resources and getting clean energy out to local communities. So this is definitely a live issue. There have been threats from lawmakers to reduce that funding, and I don't think that has been settled yet. It is very much a live issue and one that we have sent a couple of letters in on trying to make sure that those community-oriented programs are fully funded. Julia, anything?
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. Yeah, you covered everything. I was just going to say that, I think re-emphasizing one of our recommendations from the report, we really want to see this money that is going to keeping these aging and polluting gas plants online, just on standby for the most part. We want to see that redirected to these, demand side programs, DEBA, DSGS, sorry. And, there is a risk, and we are concerned that actually what might happen is the opposite of that, cutting the demand side programs and keeping the funding for keeping those gas plants online. So I would just say, yes, this is a live issue, and great question, David. And I'll pass it back to you, Jessica.
All right, thanks so much. So I do also want to just acknowledge that there are a few questions in here that our report does not directly address. So for instance, Natalia wants to know about local job opportunities in battery storage and how they compare to jobs at gas plants. This is something that is a really important question to ask, especially of developers. So our report does not directly address this, but that is a very key part of a just transition to a clean energy economy. So would really encourage you to look at asking this question of developers, and obviously keep asking. Okay, so we also have a lot of questions right now about addressing community concerns and making sure that residents understand the benefits of batteries and the cost benefits of batteries versus gas plants. And I think we're kind of circling back around to points that our panelists have already made. But if there is anything else that maybe Maya that you want to add, or folks from Regenerate California want to add about the need for just being proactive in advocacy around these cost benefits, then I can pass it to you.
Yeah, I think maybe something we haven't touched on a whole lot on as far as the education aspect goes. I completely understand why these communities are still feeling a lot of hesitancy and distrust with battery developers. And so I would just like to iterate that I think a very important step here is, we have in the environmental review, these EIRs come out for any projects. And I think a key part to gaining back this trust with the communities, and also just having an opportunity to help battle any misinformation or provide any reassurance, is going to be in that EIR stage. Because this is one of those stages in the project where communities and the public are actually able to directly engage with developers. And so, of course, there's always an issue of, are these communities actually equipped to be able to do that? And so I would maybe provide the recommendation that as developers are going through the permitting steps for projects in that EIR stage, to make sure that you're really making thoughtful outreach to these communities and giving them a chance to voice their concerns and have those conversations directly with them.
Thanks, Maya. Really appreciate that. All right, so we have some more questions in here, and we have, one question is talking about, again, the importance of educating the community, and agree, that is very important, as we have said. We have a question from Robert Garfield on funding for expanding messages, debunking misinformation on battery energy storage systems and making that available to consumers. Again, I feel like this is not quite what our report deals with, just because this is pretty much limited to a cost-benefit analysis of battery energy storage systems and comparing that with gas plants. But we definitely, I think that it's safe to say that the organizations that have put together this report, like Regenerate California and CEERT, are very actively involved in debunking misinformation and spreading that as far as possible. So we also have a question that I see Katie is writing an answer right now to, on how CCAs can promote local battery facilities. So because that one's being answered in the chat, I am going to go ahead.
I'm also happy to speak to it if it'll just take a couple minutes.
Sure, go ahead, Katie.
So CCAs are load-serving entities, so they can purchase power on behalf of their constituents. So one of the main things that they could do to help with local clean energy is to actually develop these projects. I think there's also a role for them to play in community engagement and combating misinformation by explaining how they're evaluating these resources and laying out publicly in a way accountable to their constituents, how they're evaluating the risks, how they're evaluating the benefits, and then even quantifying what those benefits look like in comparison to gas plants or any other energy type that they could have around. So CCAs have a very important role. I think they have been leaders in developing some of these projects. And so to the extent that those CCAs have had experiences, good, bad, or in the middle, it's helpful for them to explain that.
Thanks, Katie. Really appreciate that. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I see we have one more question in the chat. So this is probably where I will close us after this question. So Mark Herwick wants to know, is the idea that gas plant sites would be repurposed as battery energy storage systems? That's a really good question. Maya, is it okay if I pass this one to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that this is an idea that a lot of people are talking about right now. I think it's a very exciting possibility. I don't know that it would be general practice that necessarily every gas plant would be repurposed for a BESS facility. But there are talks of how do we start to incentivize that transition. There is one proposal out there that talks about sharing the point of interconnection gas facilities with batteries. So the idea there is that you could co-locate the battery on the facility. And then, ideally, eventually we won't have gas generation at all anymore one day. But in the time being, while we still do, so let me start first by explaining gas power plants are rated for a certain maximum output of power, right? But they very rarely actually run to that full maximum power output. So one idea could be to have the battery fill in that gap at the POI, and then even over time incrementally increase the portion of the POI that is met with the battery output versus how much is met with gas. And over time, you would transition the gas generation out and completely replace it with the battery. This is especially helpful for interconnection studies, which is one of the few, I won't even say holdups, because it's not nearly as significant of a timeline as compared to other project development stages for other technologies, but studying the interconnection for a battery can take time. And so when you share it with an existing POI, that reduces time there. And it also offers these site owners to transition to something that is cleaner, will prolong their ability to compete in the energy market once we have to retire all gas facilities. So it is a great idea. However, we still also are going after co-locating batteries with renewables, like as you said, solar. So it's both. It's a yes and answer to that question, I would say. But definitely, I think communities would be much happier with seeing a gas plant replaced with battery storage.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. I can also chime in here. Like, yeah, I think our vision is that we want to see these gas plants shut down. We don't want to see batteries prolonging gas. We don't want to see also gas plants, I guess, part of that solution necessarily. I think, you know, in when we were covering the NEIs, a lot of these impacts are because of the pollution of gas plants, and by leaning into battery energy storage, and especially co-located with solar, that's when we will see the most benefits from the technology for communities and for environmental justice communities. And so that's the future that we're leaning into, is like a future with no pollution, no emissions, reliable, resilient energy for our communities. And really excited to see that happen. We saw it happen with the Puente gas plant project in Oxnard in 2017, which was a huge campaign victory, as Rosalind was talking about earlier, for the Regenerate campaign. And seeing how, right, like the Puente plant was then replaced with the energy storage facility, and it still remains today. And so that's exactly the vision that we have for the future, is seeing how batteries can really enable gas plants to shut down and enable our clean energy future.
Thank you so much, Hina. And thank you to all of our panelists. I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you to everyone who participated in the Q&A by submitting questions. I can put my email address in the chat so that if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. As a reminder, you will all be receiving a copy of the report as well as a link to this recording. Thank you again, and please don't hesitate to reach out to the email address that I am popping in the chat right now. Thank you very much.